Alright, in this module we'll be diving into the Pandas GroupBy object, which represents one of the library's most powerful features, but also one of its most difficult to grasp for beginners. So the GroupBy object is basically created from a data frame, and what it does is create essentially groupings or categories or chunks or segments, whatever you want to call it, that are based on common values in certain columns or multiple columns in the original data frame. Now, as with a lot of technical things, it's one of those things that's best seen in action. It's a lot more difficult to describe into words. So let's get right into it by creating our brand new Jupyter notebook. I'm going to click the new button to the right here and select my Conda root environment. And let's give this notebook a name. I'm going to call it GroupBy. And everything is pointless until we import our pandas library with that familiar PD alias and execute. I'm now going to press my escape key and hold the B button a bit to insert some blank cells below. Alright, and now, as I mentioned, we're still going to be using a data frame as the basis of our GroupBy object, so I still need to import a data frame. And we're going to be using a CSV called Fortune 1000 in this module. So I'm going to call our familiar read CSV method directly on my pandas library, open my parentheses, and give it the argument of the file I want to import, and that's going to be Fortune 1000. You can use tab completion there. So let's take a look at this data frame. So if you're unaware, the Fortune 1000 is an annual list that's produced by Fortune magazine that basically details the 1,000 largest corporations in the world. I think the general formula is by profit, but I'm pretty sure it's a little bit more complex if you look behind the scenes. But anyway, we have a list here of 1,000 companies, and we have their rank on the list right here, the company name, the sector they fall into, their industry, which is sort of like a more precise sector, if you will. The values in this column are much more diverse. Here we only have a couple limited options. We have the company's location, and 3 columns to the right here, revenue, profits, and employees, which just have integer-based data about the company's performance in that current year. So there's just one tweak that I want to do here, which is we already have a rank column to the left here, which it can serve as a pretty effective index. So I'm going to use it to overwrite the default pandas index that's generated here to the left. And I can do that with my index call parameter in the read CSV method. That's short for index column, and it accepts a single string or a list of strings, and it basically uses the values there as the values for the index. So if I want my rank column to serve as my index, I can just write it in a string, and when I execute this, you'll see that the column has moved here to serve as my index. So I'm pretty satisfied with this result, so I can go ahead and store it in a variable. I'm going to call that variable Fortune, and as always, I'm going to use the head method to preview the first 3 rows and just give us a frame of reference when we're working with this data frame. So the ideal thing that you want to group by is always going to be a column that has duplicate values. This basically means you want to create segments of your data set. So for example, there's really no point grouping on company because every single value for the company column is completely unique. In comparison, a column like sector is exactly perfect for us to group by. And the reason for that is because there are multiple companies that fall into the exact same sector. Similarly, industry is another good column because multiple companies will fall into the same industry. So if we want to kind of segment the data by that column, by the sectors that the companies fall into, sector represents a really great column to do that by. So in order to create a GroupBy object, we're going to have to call a method on the data frame because a GroupBy object is created directly from a data frame. So the syntax is going to be familiar. I'm just going to reference my Fortune data frame and call a method called GroupBy. I'm going to open my parentheses and provide it an argument, which can be either a single column as a string or a list of columns. That's basically going to represent how it's going to group the rows in this data frame. So here's where I'm going to put sector to indicate that I want to create a grouping based on the values in the sector column. So how is this going to work behind the scenes? Well, what pandas is going to do is it's going to take a look at all of the values in the sector column. So for example, it's going to start at retailing. It's then going to loop through the data set and collect all the rows that fall onto that sector. So it's going to collect Walmart, for example, in the first row because that is a company in the retailing sector. And then it's going to proceed through all of the 1,000 companies here and take any rows that fall into that same sector and bundle them up in a brand new data frame. And it's going to repeat that process for every single sector that occurs here. Once it has all of these data frames, each one representing a different sector, it's then going to bundle them up and store them in a larger object, which is what our GroupBy object is. So you can sort of think of it as a container of data frames, and each one of those data frames is going to have a central theme, which in our case is going to be a common sector. So when I execute this command, we're not going to get anything incredibly visual or impressive. It's actually going to be quite underwhelming. We're basically just going to get this output below the cell that tells us that Pandas has created a data frame GroupBy object, and this is just the location in memory, which you can ignore. As long as you're getting this output, Pandas has generated this object. It just doesn't have a real visual way to display it. So now that I know that I'm getting this object with this command, I can go ahead and store it in a variable. So I'm going to store it in a variable called sectors. And because we're going to be utilizing this code throughout the entire module, I'm also going to copy this and make it part of our code for the start of each lesson. So whenever we execute the code at the beginning of a lesson, we're both going to have a fortune data frame and a sectors GroupBy object. Now keep in mind, these two are completely separate Pandas objects. People get a little bit confused, but if I pass both of them into the type Python function, you can see that they're completely different. So if I pass my fortune data frame, Python will tell us that it is a data frame object. And if we pass my sectors object, Python will tell us that it is a data frame GroupBy object. I think people get a little bit confused because data frame is still present here, but these two are completely separate objects, much like a data frame is completely separate and different from a series. They just have a common word in their name. But this represents a grouping of a data frame or a segmenting of the data frame, in this case by each value of sector that's available. And as I mentioned, or as we saw when we output sectors by itself, basically this object, this visual representation, really offers us nothing of particular value. So a GroupBy object is really pointless until we call methods upon it. Simply sectors isn't really serving any purpose besides serving as a variable that's going to reference that larger GroupBy object. So until we call a method or methods on our GroupBy object, it's really not going to give us any kind of relevant data. And starting in the next lesson, we'll start diving into what some of these available methods are in order so we can glean information from this essential container of data frames. So I look forward to another great module. This is one of the most powerful and robust features of Pandas. So it's a lot to take in, but it's just incredibly powerful when you see how quickly and amazingly it can summarize groups of data by a common theme. So I'll see you in the next lesson.